Well, hello everyone. Haven't seen you for much in a while, but welcome to the Simpademic. This is not going to be the typical edition here, because as far as that particular subject material goes, I am writing a book right now with "End the Simpademic" as a title, and therefore this channel is kind of held in dormant status right now while I put that together. And once that book does come out, this channel will be used to promote that. But in the interim, I have a little bit of a different idea, and I'm taking this a big different route. And I want to put out a few short episodes here while I am authoring that book about people in history who have not necessarily become widely acclaimed, but who I think should. And I'm going to go through a series of people in history whose exploits have been truly remarkable, and yet I don't think they've ever received the credit for it. So let's just get this thing started right now. My first person is Charles Lightoller. And if you watch the movie Titanic, you do know that he was the highest ranking senior officer to survive the disaster. He was the second officer on the Titanic, and accomplished British naval officer. And when you talk about women and children first in the Titanic, that was his policy and that was his doing, to have women and children get in the lifeboats first. And that particular catchphrase still is known today. So Lightoller survived the Titanic by divine providence, and he knew it, because what happened was that as the ship was starting to sink and as the stern started to rise, he knew that it was within minutes of going below the water. So he jumped from the stern and went right on in, not knowing what was going to happen next. Well, here's what happened next. The boilers in the lower levels of the ship, which were already underwater, actually exploded soon after he jumped into the water. Now, these boilers were still generating significant amounts of heat. And so as they exploded after the ship went under, he was caught up in some of the heat. Now remember, the North Atlantic Ocean was at 28 degrees or minus 2 degrees Celsius at that point. So most people who jumped in the water died a few minutes after reaching the water. However, because of this boiler explosion, he had extra heated water, which blew him to the top of the surface. And as fortune would have it, he landed next to a lifeboat. One of the lifeboats that he had sent in after singing women and children only. And Lightoller managed to make it into the raft. I don't know if it's a collapsible, if it's a lifeboat or not, but either way, he managed to make it in, and he did survive. And, if the story ends right at this particular point, it's remarkable on its own. But this is not the end of his story, not by any means. It did not end in 1912. The last chapter of the story actually happened in 1941. And by this point, Lightoller was retired and had his own little boat, for personal purposes. However, at the same time, the Allied soldiers were being pushed back by the Wehrmacht, or the German armed forces, back onto the coastline in northern France, at a town called Dunkirk. And so the call had went out from the Royal Navy that basically anybody with a seaworthy vessel of any kind was being requested to offer it up to the Royal Navy to evacuate these trapped soldiers who were on the beach across the English Channel from where he was. And so Lightoller said, sure, but on one condition. And that condition was that he would be driving his own ship or boat. And given his status as a national hero after the Titanic disaster, the Royal Navy wasn't about to tell him no. And because of this, he ran his small boat, and he was one of the thousands of little ships of Dunkirk, which pulled off the greatest naval evacuation in world history at the time. Well, not even at the time. It's still the greatest evacuation in world history. In 1941, Charles Lightoller drove a steamship or boat, and he single-handedly evacuated, reportedly along the lines of 2,000 to 3,000 trapped Allied soldiers, brought them back to Great Britain, and they lived to fight another day. Many of those lived to fight in the Normandy landing that would happen the following year, when they came back and made the greatest amphibious landing in world history. It still is. So the entire picture of Charles Lightoller can be researched, but it's almost never stated. And he said about his survival from the Titanic, with God all things are possible. Well, I think his purpose was to go back, to go to the northern coast of France almost 30 years later and rescue Allied soldiers who would then go back in 1942 for the Normandy landing, who would return themselves. And of course, that is the landing that basically ended the war for Nazi Germany. The result hadn't been determined yet. That for all intents and purposes, that invasion and that landing, for all intents and purposes, meant that the war was basically decided at that point. Germany was going to go down. It's just a question of how long. Of course, 3 years after that, we all know what happened. So Lightoller had a relatively small role in the Dunkirk evacuation, which went on to evacuate 300,000 Allied soldiers who were trapped by the Nazis on the coast. Which gave the question, why didn't Hitler finish them off? Well, it has been said that Hitler wanted to negotiate peace terms with the British because he saw them as white Aryans, as the Germans were. So he wanted to give them an out, and this was his way of doing it. Of course, no such peace deal ever happened, and of course the British went on to be part of the invasion of Berlin in 1945. So Charles Lightoller is an underrated man of history. I will be back tomorrow. And tomorrow I'm going to talk about the man who really did turn the tide in World War II. He's almost never talked about outside of Russia. And you're going to get a load of this story because he is just, again, one man can change history. Lightoller changed history on two ends. This next man tomorrow changed the course of an entire war. Again, he's only mentioned in the Soviet Union or Russia. But you're going to love that story too. So I will see you all tomorrow. Be back for Sunday. Peace out, homies.